I love the movie. You know what I mean? It was great. I was actually talking to a young mom. A really interesting story, right? Italian American woman, racially identified as white. She adopts, right, 2 black kids. And we've been having these conversations for years, since like 10 years ago. And so, her question, of course, is, around culture and all the rest of this. What are your thoughts? What should I do? How should I work? So we've been talking about it. But the beauty of Black Panther helped me to give her some advice. Because what you're seeing is a Pan-African display, right, of all of the symbols and the substance in a movie related to Africa, right? So, there's lots of great metaphors there. So I was able to share with her a great video that kind of defined the visual aspects of African culture and helped to draw them back to actual nations of people and ethnicities. So part of what you're seeing, every symbol in Black Panther is connected to a historically African not only way of life, right, but also high art and culture and civilization and all the rest of that. To me, what's interesting too is that the movie tapped into the age-old desire, right, to see Africans and African Americans in a positive light. And though it's a comic book movie, what's important is that symbol says something, right, to African Americans inside of a world that does not favor blackness, that does not favor African Americans and Africans as legitimate. Now, the other part, too, is the deep history of it. I mean, although much of the history of Africa is, lost, stolen, strayed, deliberately obscured, the movie created an inflection point for people to get more involved in understanding, right, the history of Canambono, or the kingdom of Ghana, or the kingdom of Kush, or any of those civilizations that were, at their height and at their zenith in terms of high art and culture and language transformation and orality, right, as a historical art form, and literature. All of these items that we attribute to high civilization. Africa was at its height in doing this, while Europe was in
the Dark Ages.
The Middle Ages. Yeah. And that is to say, this is important, is that a lot of the reason why we talk about African history and culture and art is because there's been such a concerted effort to destroy that, to say that you didn't come from anywhere, that you have no language. We talked about this in class, right? People look at black language or African American speech and they call it slang, as opposed to recognizing that what you're hearing is the remnant of an African accent, and also, right, the substructure of African, for lack of a better way to say it, grammatical structure, right? We talked about this in class, right? You may hear a black person say IB, right? Yeah. Most people look at that and they say that's slang. But if you go look back at the Bantu languages, right, 300 to 600 ethnic groups throughout the African continent, right, are identified in terms of the Bantu languages. Bantu languages, many of them have a verb and subject agreement form that is not transitory, meaning there is no being, there is no has been, there's only be, right? And so when folks are speaking that, you'll say, oh, that's not grammatically correct. Well, that's not grammatically correct in English, but it's grammatically correct in those Bantu languages. And that's like a heavy, kind of detailed aspect of what we call Africanisms. There's this book by Joseph Holloway that really gets into that. And there's another book called Talking and Testifying by Geneva Smitherman. And all of those groups basically say the same thing. Yes, of course, Africans have culture, and their culture is rooted in their language, and the evidence of that language is not gone anywhere simply because, someone stole you from some place or sold you from some place and took you to another place. Culture persists over time. So the movie is brilliant in bringing up all of the issues around African and African American identity that are required in the age of unapologetic blackness, that are required for young people to know and understand. During my time, we had Afrocentricity, and we had Malife Asante, and we had a lot of literature related to that. And this, to me, at least from my point of view, is a culmination of understanding that. And here's the interesting thing to say. It's needed. It's not enough, but it's absolutely needed and warranted. And we saw that. Africans and African Americans all over the world, including folks of every ethnicity and race, showed up to see what's it all about, and they kept going back. It was one of the highest rated movies, in cinema history, and that's important because cinema history starts with, right? It starts with Birth of a Nation. It starts with a characterization of black people as savage. So to have this movie as a bookend, right, in terms of that history of how Hollywood wants to create and present this societally reinforced narrative, right, of black inferiority, to see a film that says, well, here's an alternative to that theory. Here is some information, some symbols and ideas that are counter to that idea. That's highly important, and I think we'll see the effects in the future. Because movies for the most part are the new literature, and so we can see the resonance that the film is bringing. But I'm appreciative because it gives us an opportunity to talk about the history of African Americans, and that it doesn't start with slavery, and that it begins, like all human endeavors, with civilization, with high art and science and technology and literature and orality. It puts us back into the common conversation around our own humanity, and that's important.